A decorated Vietnam veteran and devout Mormon, Richard Floyd McCoy Jr. was not the kind of guy you would expect to do what he did. If you'd met him back then, you'd probably think he was on track for a long, respectable career in public service. But underneath that polished surface, something was brewing. It was something nobody saw coming, and when it finally surfaced, it left the country stunned and scrambling for answers. Welcome to Capers and Cocktails, a true crime podcast that doesn't take itself too seriously and gives you something to enjoy while you listen. The following content may be disturbing to some. Discretion is advised. If you're enjoying one of our themed cocktails, ensure you're of legal drinking age and have fun, but drink responsibly. Richard Floyd McCoy Jr. was born on December 7, 1942 in Kinston, North Carolina. His parents, Myrtle Helen McCoy and Richard Floyd McCoy Sr., were first cousins. The second episode of Late with First Cousin Parents. Have we learned nothing? I guess not. Richard grew up in the small community of Cove City. In 1962, he made a big move west to Provo, Utah, enrolling at Brigham Young University. But just a year later, duty called and Richard left school to join the U.S. Army. He served honorably for 2 years during the Vietnam War, working as a demolition expert and helicopter pilot, earning a Purple Heart in 1964 for wounds sustained in action. In 1965, after his tour, Richard returned to Utah to resume his studies at BYU, majoring in political science, and also joined the Utah Air National Guard. He met Karen Louise Burns while he was studying at BYU, and they married in August of 1965. Apparently, he couldn't get enough of Vietnam because he signed up for another Army term strictly on the condition he could go back there. In his second term, he was awarded the Army Commendation Medal and the Distinguished Flying Cross. When he came back to his family in Utah, he served as a warrant officer in the Utah National Guard and studied law enforcement at BYU, apparently aspiring to become an FBI agent. I guess he changed his major. By 1971, Karen and Richard had 2 children, Shantae and Richard III. He was deeply active in his Mormon faith, taught Sunday school, and in his free time became an avid skydiver. Spoiler alert. Okay, well, before I spoil it all, let's drink, shall we? While The White Russian became a cult classic because of the 1998 film The Big Lebowski, the drink was actually first created in 1949 in Belgium, although the inventor, Gustav Tops, whipped it up without the cream. He called it the Black Russian. Legend says that the name Russian just comes from the fact that the base spirit was vodka. It became pretty popular in the 1970s, right around the time that Richard was doing his thing, and people thought of it as the original adult milkshake. The simple drink, Kahlúa, vodka, and cream will have you pretending you're wearing a bathrobe and warning people that there's a beverage nearby. Or if you're, on an airplane, maybe? Speaking of airplanes, at some point between being a Mormon Sunday school teacher and raising his 2 kids, things somehow went wrong. Pretty sure it was a significant need for some cash. On April 7, 1972, Richard boarded United Airlines Flight 855 under the alias James Johnson. Remember, this was not like a post-9/11 world. This was one of those only in the 70s moments. In 1972, airline security was incredibly lax. There was no mandatory ID check for domestic flights, and you could buy a ticket with cash, write down whatever name you wanted, and no one would ask for proof. Baggage screening was rare. Airline officials mostly visually inspected passengers and their carry-ons unless you looked suspicious, and you didn't even have to walk through a metal detector. Okay, so even if you could, most people who didn't have a nefarious intent wouldn't just hop on a flight and use an alias. You probably did have nefarious intent. And Richard did definitely, aka the most basic alias of all time, James Johnson. The flight Richard boarded was a Boeing 727 en route from Newark, New Jersey to Los Angeles, California, carrying 85 passengers and 6 crew members. Approximately 20 minutes after takeoff at 5:18 p.m., a male passenger was observed in his seat holding a hand grenade. Disguised with a wig and fake mustache, Richard passed a note to a flight attendant claiming he had a hand grenade and a pistol. Yeah, he did. They could see it. Does this sound familiar? I'll come back to that. He demanded $500,000 or more than $3.5 million in 2025 dollars in ransom along with 4 parachutes. Does this sound familiar? Yeah, I'll come back to that. This series of events happened so quickly that most passengers were unaware of the threat. An envelope with skyjacking instructions was given to the captain, with 2 typed pages of highly detailed directions, a hand grenade pin, and a bullet. Based on the instructions, the plane made an emergency landing at San Francisco International Airport, where the captain parked at runway 19 left. Authorities delivered the ransom and parachutes. Once he had the money, Richard released the passengers and one of the stewardesses. He then ordered the rest of the crew into the cockpit and took a position in the back of the plane. Richard ordered the pilots to take off again, instructing them to fly in a zigzag course eastward to confuse law enforcement tracking them. He ordered the cabin depressurized and warned that if any pursuit planes were spotted, he would detonate a hidden bomb after he had jumped, but before the plane could be landed. At some point over Utah, Richard opened the Boeing 727's aft staircase, a feature that allowed passengers to deplane from the back, and parachuted into the cold, dark night with the ransom strapped to him. Does this sound familiar? Yes. I'll come back to that. 5 hours after the skyjacking began, the weary crew headed for the Salt Lake City International Airport. Richard, meanwhile, landed pretty hard in the middle of a cow pasture from 14,000 feet, just outside of Provo, Utah. He saw a diner in the distance and decided to stash the cash and his parachute in a culvert before heading in for a sweet treat. He ordered a chocolate malt, using his ransom cash to pay. Police, naturally, started investigating the case, and the FBI, blah, 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 blah. They pretty quickly got a tip from a motorist, 16-year-old Pete Zimmerman, who said he'd picked up Richard from the diner where he was hitchhiking. Richard was wearing a jumpsuit and carrying a duffel bag. Pete thought that was a little bit weird, but he went ahead and dropped Richard off a few blocks from his house, and Richard slept in his own bed that night, after he stopped by his stash site to pick up the cash and the parachute. Evidently, Richard had also bragged to a buddy about how easy it would be to carry out his own D.B. Cooper skyjacking, and that person was not a good enough friend to keep his mouth shut and also went straight to the FBI. Oh, also, Richard wasn't exactly careful and was exactly the kind of guy, in the freaking military to have his fingerprints on file. Investigators found fingerprints on several items left on the plane, including an in-flight magazine that he touched. They also managed to match his handwriting to that first note he'd handed the flight attendant. The FBI tracked down a photo of Richard, too, and witnesses quickly ID'd him. Richard was pretty good at skydiving, but he certainly wasn't very good at being a criminal. Just 2 days later, on April 9th, 1972, authorities arrested him at his home in Provo, Utah. The day before, he'd been on National Guard duty, flying one of the helicopters involved in the search for himself. When agents searched his house, they found a jumpsuit, a duffel bag with $49,970 and a handgun. The duffel had been stuffed into a cardboard box and then shoved into one of his closets. He'd only managed to spend $30 before getting himself arrested. As he went on his perp walk, he would tell the media, quote, "It's embarrassing, let's face it," end quote. Richard pleaded not guilty in the trial that started in June of 1972. The jury convicted him of aircraft piracy after only 90 minutes of deliberation. And in September 1972, Richard was sentenced to 45 years in federal prison. Richard was in the Federal Correctional Institute in Lewisburg, Pennsylvania, serving his 45-year sentence when he decided he wasn't going to stay locked away, either in an airplane cabin or a prison cell. Using dental paste he managed to smuggle out of the dental office where he had access, he meticulously created a fake handgun. On August 10th, 1974, he and a crew of his convict buddies commandeered a garbage truck and crashed it through the prison gates. They escaped, and Richard stayed one step ahead of the law for 3 months, staying on the run until November 9th, 1974. FBI agents tracked him down to a house in Virginia Beach, Virginia. When they attempted to arrest him, a gunfight broke out, and Richard was killed in the shootout. He was a month shy of his 32nd birthday. Okay, so some of the cocktail conspirators out there must remember that we covered a very similar case just last season. Yes, we're coming back to it, the D.B. Cooper case, which took place just a year before this skyjacking. And there are some pretty striking similarities between this case and that one. Just a quick refresher. The D.B. Cooper case happened on November 24th, 1971, when a man using the name Dan Cooper skyjacked a Northwest Orient flight from Portland to Seattle. He claimed to have a bomb, demanded $200,000 in ransom and 4 parachutes, and after getting what he asked for, jumped out of the back of the Boeing 727 somewhere over Washington state, disappearing into the night. Despite an extensive manhunt and decades of investigation, no one has ever conclusively identified or captured him, making it one of the greatest unsolved mysteries, or at least crimes, in American history. Richard's case does seem to bear an uncanny resemblance to the D.B. Cooper case. Both skyjackers wore disguises. Both demanded a large sum of money and parachutes. Both escaped mid-flight by jumping from the aft or rear staircase of a Boeing 727. Some investigators definitely believed that Richard and D.B. were the same person. However, there are lots of differences between the two skyjackings. D.B. Cooper wore a business suit, sunglasses, and a tie and looked polished and professional. Richard wore a wig, fake mustache, and painted on makeup. He had more of a thrown-together disguise. D.B. was calm, polite, and low-key. He even called the flight attendants nice and tipped them. Richard was more aggressive and forceful. He wasn't rude, but much more businesslike and urgent. D.B. skyjacked a flight between Portland and Seattle, which was a relatively short distance, and jumped over a forested, mountainous terrain. Richard skyjacked a transcontinental Newark to LA flight and jumped over Utah's desert areas. D.B. specifically requested civilian parachutes and picked one that turned out to be a training chute by accident. Richard also demanded parachutes, but, being a skilled skydiver, knew exactly what he was doing with the equipment. And lastly, most witnesses say that D.B. was in his mid-40s and Richard was 29. Probably most importantly, Richard was actually eliminated by the FBI as a suspect in the Cooper case in 1972. Some people cannot be convinced that the two men were different. In 1991, two former FBI agents, Bernie Rhodes and Russell Calamay, published a book called D.B. Cooper, The Real McCoy, arguing that Richard had been D.B. Cooper all along. That's a very clever name for a book. Anyway, after the book was published, Karen McCoy, Richard's widow, filed a lawsuit against the authors, the publisher, and her former attorney. She claimed they had falsely portrayed her role in Richard's skyjacking and misrepresented events from interviews she had given to her attorney back in the 1970s. Karen actually sought an injunction to block the book's publication and distribution. During the court proceedings, however, evidence came out that Karen had been more deeply involved in the skyjacking than she had previously admitted. Truth is the perfect defense. Karen McCoy wasn't just standing on the sidelines. She helped Richard plan the hijacking, hid evidence afterwards, and created an alibi to cover his tracks. Although she was never criminally charged, her role, it was pretty undeniable. Her attempt to stop the book sales entirely was denied. More recently, in 2024, a parachute was discovered by Richard's children in a storage unit that had belonged to his late wife. The parachute allegedly matches the exact specifications of the parachute used by D.B. Cooper. The FBI took possession of the parachute and collected DNA samples, but so far, testing hasn't confirmed a link to the original D.B. Cooper evidence. I guess we'll just have to wait and see what happens there. Thanks for hanging out with me. It's too bad that a Vietnam veteran that came back to the U.S. was not taken care of mentally or financially enough to ensure that he wouldn't skyjack an entire plane for the cash. It ends up being such a sad story, actually, of mental illness, financial strain, and lack of resources in the end. He was only 31 when he died, leaving behind a wife and young kids. There is no such thing as a victimless crime. Even the criminal is sometimes a victim, at least in some ways. I am curious if you think that he did this twice, $200,000 the first time, got away with it, tried to do it again. Who knows, but you should tell me in the comments what you think. Anyway, enough of that. Next week, parents try to sell their babies. Yep, that's regret for having children to the highest degree. I'll see you then, and remember, there are always alternatives to stealing a plane for the cash. But if you're going to do it, wear gloves and don't tell even your best friend one thing about it.